So hello everyone and welcome to the second episode of QCMHA's podcast series. I'm Alex and I'm joined with Taylor as my host, and we are going to be hosting the second episode. Today we're joined with Roy Hennig, the VP of Sales at LyricFind. Throughout Roy's journey in the music industry, he has learned a lot about the necessary turbulence and adaptability of working in sales. LyricFind specializes in providing licensing, lyric display, and synchronization to businesses that want to encourage music discovery, engagement, and provide a complete enhanced music experience. Not only is Roy's work in this digital era incredibly relevant and exciting, he has also learned a lot along his way regarding the importance of mental health and looking out for yourself. Thank you again to Roy for being on this podcast, and we are so excited to have you.
My pleasure, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Amazing. So after that little introduction, I think we can jump right into a couple of the questions that we have.
Sure.
And the first one is, we'd love to just hear a little bit more if you could tell us about your experience in the music industry, such as what has inspired you to pursue your current position, as well as how did you start at LyricFind and where would you describe yourself at today?
Sure. Excellent. Definitely a mouthful, but a lot to tackle. Let's see. So, I've been now with LyricFind for just over 11 years. And it's been, as you said, it's been very turbulent, but it's been very transformative as well. I mean, the digital music landscape over the last 11 years has been exponential. It's been huge. I remember when I joined back in 2009, the big streaming service that people were listening to music, if it wasn't, being downloaded or ripped, was a service called Rhapsody, which in Canada didn't even really exist. I mean, in Canada, maybe, but it was primarily in the US. And, people were still sort of hooked on the idea that you could buy CDs still and buy albums, right? And people did that. I mean, iTunes was just coming around and just blowing up. But a lot has changed since then, and now everything is streaming. Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, for example, dominate the streaming space in the world, although there are plenty of other DSPs, especially outside of North America, that have a ton of users and are just making sure that people listen to music. But how did I get involved into this industry? Well, that's a good one. So 11 years ago, I was at a crux, a crossroad, I guess you would say, of my life, where I was at the end of a big breakup and I needed some change. And I just happened to know somebody, actually my boss at the time, I was working sales for Rogers, who happened to be dating somebody who worked, or rather went to school, these two guys who had this startup, something to do with music and lyrics. They went to the University of Waterloo, and they just happened to be looking for somebody in sales. As somebody who had been working in the telco sales space for let's say 2-3 years, I was ready for something different. I had, performed very well in Toronto. I worked at the flagship store down at Yonge and Dundas, and I needed something else. And so I met up with the CEO within a week or so of this sort of moment, and he, I guess, kicked it off, did really well. And he gave me a call the next day to say, hey, well, actually after a week or so of further interviews, but I finally got the call to say, hey, we'd love for you to join the team. And I guess it's been a lot of stories ever since. And I feel like there's a few more questions packed into that.
Maybe I guess from there, I think that's awesome just to hear about your journey to get to LyricFind, but how would you describe starting at LyricFind to where you are today in your position?
Got it. So tricky and bumpy would be words used to describe it. It was very new to me. As somebody who's always loved technology and music, of course, it felt relatively natural. But finding myself in a position where there were a lot of unknowns, and we didn't know everything that was happening in this space. So I spent a lot of time, especially during that first 6 months and a year plus. I mean, I'm still constantly learning, but I was educating myself about how to sort of do what it is that I needed to be doing. And, going from a position where I was, having people sign up for 3 years to sign up for their latest and greatest iPhone or BlackBerry or even Android, actually. I remember being part of that launch when that first started, is one thing. It's another thing to be talking to a CEO of a company representing sort of millions and millions, if not more, of annual revenue. So you have to sort of check yourself real quick, but at the same time, be confident enough in what you're doing. And, I spent a lot of time understanding the technology that our company brought to the table. And, was trying to really figure out what it is that, the industry needed from us and what we could offer. And admittedly, the first couple of years were rough in terms of just, educating the market on why lyrics were important. And I mean, I think it's pretty natural if you ask anybody who likes music, which just happens to be almost everyone, why lyrics are important to them. It's interesting, you'll get a lot of different sort of reasons back, but at the end of the day, most people are like, yeah, they're important, right? They're valued, they bring something to me, they do something. It's very cathartic, perhaps. And, there's a bunch of other reasons too, but it was exciting to be a part of that. So, I learned from just sort of doing. So, which I know we'll talk about more later in this podcast, but it's just that experience of just trying and doing it. And sort of what really excited me about this position in the job is that it would involve a lot of travel. As somebody who hadn't traveled too much, this was really the first time now that I was going to be spending a lot of time, say, in the United States and a little bit of Europe, progressing the business. I was going to cities like San Francisco and New York, Las Vegas, Austin, Nashville, for example, going to these gigantic conferences for music and tech, and sometimes more, and having to represent the company. And, you get really good at sort of understanding what you do by talking about it. And sort of that act of sort of engaging with folks, especially strangers, and companies that everybody's familiar with, but it's one thing to know Google. It's another thing to know the person who works at Google, who represents Google or Apple or Amazon and Twitter, for example. But these are the sort of people that I got to meet and sort of I got to know and learn from. And you learn a lot by messing up and not having all the answers to everything all at the right time. But, the key to sort of overcoming that is just, you just be honest, be authentic, don't say this about your product or your strategy or your offering if that's not true. It's one thing if it's an honest mistake, because that happens, but it's another thing to sort of overpromise and underdeliver. That sucks. Nobody likes that. So I hope that helped.
Yeah.
Or makes sense, rather.
Yeah, I thought that was great and definitely really touched on. I was thinking as you were speaking, like, to ask how do you manage change and how are you so adaptable, but I think you really touched on that as well, incredibly well, and it's a great segue into some of our further questions.
Sure.
Taylor, did you want to add anything about that one?
I think that really summed up for me. I think that's a great, just to give a little bit of overview of where you started, where, like, what you've kind of been through and where you're at today. So that was awesome for me.
Yeah, I thought it was great background. Okay.
Now, one thing to actually, sorry, just to interrupt. What's important too, because it's easy to sort of, see a person and see their career for what they've done in it. I started off as, say, a director of sales, and now I'm the VP. That's the career side of things. There's also like the personal and like the personal side of things, right? Like how much I've gone from, I was single post breakup to, meeting the love of my life like a year into LyricFind, married, and then having kids as well too. So it's amazing how that's been all a part of it, but I know we'll talk about it too.
It's like a big holistic journey. There's so much depth going into everything as well. Awesome.
Everything's sort of connected.
Definitely.
Okay, so next we can jump into the second question.
Sure.
So we wanted to ask you, how has mental health influenced or changed your life, both personally and professionally, and how has it been a part of your journey up to where you are today?
Sure. So I guess, starting at the beginning, I guess it's important to sort of frame what we mean by mental health and I guess our sort of mental sort of state of well-beingness. And I was thinking about this, of course, in prep for this this podcast. And, it's important to note that that our mental health changes over time. And it's there for us when we need it at the moment. And it's one thing for us to sort of project in the future and to see our future selves and sort of where we might be, but at the same time to really appreciate where we are now. But we also do that by understanding and reflecting on what's happened in the past. So, let's talk about, say, growing up. I grew up in a home where, middle-class home, I had a roof over my head. You know, not that we had the most amount of money in the world, but by no means were we struggling to get by, or at least I didn't think. And you know, it was okay. There was a lot of love, right? My father worked 9 to 5. I didn't see him too much, and I was at home with my mom. I was a stay-at-home mother, and she was great. I've got 2 sisters, one older, one younger. But this is where the crux of mental health begins, is that, you know, I come from a family where, you know, my mother's got, you know, bipolar. And growing up, that wasn't really diagnosed. And so there were these ups and downs. There were bouts of, say, perhaps when she was in the hospital, where we as kids were either at home with, say, my dad or different grandparents, just as we were sort of getting by. But then I've also got a sister who, you know, wasn't dealt, you know, the best, you know, cards of life, one could argue, who, you know, does have a lot of mental health issues, from, you know, being on the spectrum to borderline schizophrenia and other sort of like serious mental health stuff. And, you know, being a part of that really shaped, I guess, who I was, you know, as somebody in elementary school, you know, dealing with all the bullying and just the hardships of just growing up and sort of becoming who you are. And then there's high school, which, as we all know, is tricky in itself for a lot of reasons, especially because there are so many pressures of the real world kicking in and forcing you to sort of be someone as you're trying to figure out who you are. And then there's university, where you're like, okay, well, I got this. And then you get there, and you're like, wait a second, this is a little trickier than I thought it was going to be. Or I thought I knew who I was, and I'll still hold on to that, but I'm changing, and that's okay. And so during that process of going from, say, university and then to the working world and then into the family world, you know, there's this sort of, I can't understand it, but I come from a background, I guess if you understand maybe my family, maybe it makes sense, but, you know, like I grew up with a lot of depression and really not understanding, why did I feel this way? And that coupled with this idea of, you know, why do I do the things that I do? Has led me a lot to sort of thinking about, okay, well, this idea of mental well-being and feeling okay with who I am, what I'm doing, for the most part, it has been a lot of who I am. And just, it's shaped everything, from the personal relationships that I have with my family and friends, my colleagues, as well as people that I meet on the road that I work with professionally. So I think I would argue that sort of this background of just life and hardship, perhaps, and we'll talk about this with reference to the book that you mentioned, or you will mention shortly, that, you know, it does shape who you are. And sort of, I guess I've been able to take that professionally into a world where at the end of the day, you know, I'm expected to close deals, but that's due to sort of connecting with people and sort of bridging the gap between what a company may or may not need and what we offer, and sort of intertwining the two. And sort of, I can do that best because I can really connect with people. And I guess it's one of my superpowers per se, but it's something I enjoy the most, or I like about myself a lot, is being able to connect with other people, such as you two, even now, and having this conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think that's awesome. And I think that ties directly to something else we wanted to ask you about. I know from our previous discussion before, you're speaking to how important you think is to be authentic to yourself and authentic to what you value and what's important to you. And you, again, you just spoke to like connecting with others. That's a strength of yours and probably something very authentic to who you are. So I'd love to just know a bit more about, how do you manage being true to yourself? And could you touch a little bit more on that idea of authenticity and what that means to you, especially given our listeners of young students who sometimes can feel, as you're speaking to, a little bit lost or not really knowing where they're going. So can you speak to kind of like what authenticity means to you?
Sure. I suppose I would argue that it has something to do with trusting your inner instincts, trusting your inner gut, right? Because at any given day, at school, in the classroom, at the job, on a Friday night or a Saturday night, you're going to be confronted with a variety of different scenarios and situations where you're going to either have to say yes or no. And in those moments, you know, sometimes, and most of the time, it's relatively easy, and other times it isn't. And it's okay to say yes when you probably should say no, and it's okay sometimes to say no, or sometimes you should say yes, because you learn a lot about yourself that way. And so, you know, I guess it has a lot to do with, you know, learning by falling and not just sort of learning by making mistakes, but it's more importantly, getting back up again. You know, I have two kids, 4 and 2. Two beautiful, brave, strong, and brilliant young, well, daughters. And I tell them all the time, when we're outside playing around, we're walking on different things. And, you know, my eldest likes to jump around and everything, like a little, you know, it's great. And I encourage that. Play hard. But just remember two very important things, maybe 3, I guess. 1, protect your face, because it's only a matter of time before you fall. And 2, when you fall, pick yourself up. Mm-hmm. So what does being authentic to myself mean? It just means listening to yourself a lot and sort of trying to act upon that. And sort of, you know, I have a very wise friend, his name's Kevin, and he said to me in a discussion similar to this, you know, when I'm often in a position where I have to make a decision, I often think, well, what would my future self say to myself about this looking back now? And that's a really good way of thinking about it. It's not just, okay, what would my old self do? It's also what myself say 10 years from now, living with whatever it is that we're about to decide may have to live with. What would they say? You know, and sometimes they'll be like, it doesn't matter. And it's amazing how many times something so important at the time can be so meaningful, and yet if you think just a few steps beyond, you're like, you know what, it doesn't matter that much. So go have fun. Make a few mistakes, but learn from them and reflect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that also directly ties to the whole idea of students struggling with imposter syndrome, or anyone struggling with imposter syndrome, because it's one thing to like kind of accept yourself and be authentic with who you are, but then another thing to recognize your strengths and be able to give yourself credit where credit is due. So I'd love it. Could you speak to kind of any experiences you've had with imposter syndrome yourself, or how would you suggest others cope with any feelings like this that they're experiencing?
For sure. The first thing, the tricky thing with imposter syndrome too is just, I hate the name, right? Because the reality is all of us feel insecure and anxious and nervous about lots of things all the time, and that's okay. You know, in anticipation of this podcast with you two, I was feeling nervous. I thought, wow, I'm going to have to make sure that I can, you know, hopefully say the right things that are meaningful and things that are also authentic to who I am and what I'm doing. So that's important to recognize, but it's also important to know that as we progress from life, from being, say, son or daughter to our parents, to partner, to whoever it is we're seeing, if we're seeing somebody, of course, to student, to worker, is that our rules and sort of the expectations and the forces from the external world are going to be rampant and always hard, but, and that's okay. It's okay to sort of feel uncertain and uncomfortable, sort of embrace it, right? You know, I'd say don't be a jackass, or at least not all the time, because there's something to learn through that experience as well too, because, you know, it's okay to be silly, and I encourage that, because humor is very important to our mental health all the time. And sort of, if you can't laugh at yourself for either a good or a bad decision you've made, then maybe it's worth reflecting on why you're not. So imposter syndrome, take a bite out of it. It's okay. We all deal with it. That expression, fake it till you make it, I guess it's true, right? Like, yeah, you know, the first few times, who am I kidding? The first years, even now, you know, when I'm about to hop on a call with, you know, a CXO of an important sort of company or business doing something exciting, yeah, of course, I think, who am I to talk to these people? And then I realize, oh, wait, they're a person just like I am, and they have feelings too. So, you know, if you start thinking about things like that, it makes it a lot easier and more accessible, perhaps. So, takeaway notes, it's okay. And just learn from everything and reflect.
I think that's awesome. So much for students to take away, not only like going forward in their careers, but right now I know people are worried about job interviews and stuff like that. So especially what you're saying, like fake it till you make it, and they're a person too, I think are such great pieces of advice to like, that will hopefully really resonate with people, because it does with me.
And you know what, actually with that in mind too, there's 2 other things. One, be confident, don't be cocky. You know, because one of the things that we'll all go through in university too, oh my gosh, myself especially, is that you think you know things. You think you understand how the world that works. And then all of a sudden you have that professor or friendship. I try to combine those 2 words. And and they just rock your socks. And there's something that they say or do or make you feel that just puts you into the space of like cognitive dissonance where, you know, you thought you understood the world that you're living in. Now you're dealing with something else. And you're sort of in this gap of like holding on to do different sort of threads of life. And that's okay too. And I think life's a lot more fun when you don't think you really know everything, because, hey, I'm a student of life and I'm still learning. I know less now than I did when I was in university. That makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point on just like being a little bit vulnerable as well to like the situations of, it's like everyone has their own story and their own things to share with the world. And it's great to just be open to that knowledge as well, like not being closed off thinking like, okay, I've come this far in my career, I know everything up to this point. It's great to just remain open-minded. And I love that you said you're a student of life. That's such a great perspective to have.
Yeah. I mean, even now, like 10 years into about 15 years into sales, I'm constantly reading as much as I can about the profession itself in a holistic sense too.
Mm-hmm. So on the topic of reading, last time we spoke, you briefly talked about a book you're reading called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Is that how you pronounce his last name?
I think so. I mean,
Okay,
at least in my head,
awesome.
Viktor Frankl. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I looked a little bit into this book, so I was very curious. And what stood out to me a lot was him discussing the notion that we can't escape suffering, but we can cope with it and find meaning in it. And he also discusses how our primary drive in life is not pleasure, rather it's pursuing something that we find personally meaningful. So I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on this book? And if you could talk a little bit about finding meaning in life and just what you've gathered through your reading.
Big questions.
It is a loaded
question. It's important to note too that, Viktor Frankl is from the school of psychotherapy. And when he says that the purpose of life isn't for pleasure per se, that's a knock against sort of Freud, right? Who was the founding father of this sort of idea. And so and where this stems from is that I think Viktor Frankl is a very, very successful, psychotherapist, psychologist, from the school of Austria. And he was a Holocaust survivor. And so talk about, he spent, between say 2 and 4 years in the concentration camps and saw many of his friends and people around him not make it through. And so, you think a lot, you learn a lot about yourself in situations like that, which I couldn't even begin to fathom, right? As somebody who was born in 1981. Yeah, I just dated myself. And, but, and so sort of this idea of sort of meaning and where do we find meaning is very important and more relevant to me than ever these days, because I find I spend a lot of my time thinking about, what do I find that is fulfilling? What is meaningful to me? And I mentioned this earlier, I think in the podcast, and I often think about, why do I do the things that I do? Right. And I think without making that connection, what do I find meaningful and where do I find meaning? Sort of, they all connect. And so, I don't have a definitive answer per se to any of this, but I think life, it is a progress, right? It's right. And he references in the book too, is that if the pursuit is happiness itself, like any other sort of addiction, we're always going to be sort of like trying to find the next thing that gets us there. Whereas if we really start to embrace this sort of journey of life, what it is that we're doing, we're working. Well, why are we working? And we're like raising your children or getting through school. Why am I in school? Well, is it because I want to get a job? Well, why do you want to get a job? Okay, well, I want to make some money. Of course, that's important, but you want to live. Well, what does that really mean? These are the sort of questions that this book sort of helps open up and has helped me crystallize in terms of, okay, these are some of the things that I've been thinking about. It helps that somebody has sort of put it down to frame these ideas. And so we're all going to have our own separate sort of purpose and sort of meaning and journey. And, it's important to sort of go through that discovery. And you do it by learning a lot about yourself and connecting with the folks around you. Because at the end of the day, especially now during a pandemic, that's all you've got. Especially when you can't even physically really see the people that you want to see, at least within limitation, of course. And so like now, you take this idea of suffering from the book that he mentions, the pandemic. We could look at, well, why is this happening to me? And we could get bogged down in sort of, these negative thoughts. And it's okay to sort of to think about that for a little while and really deeply reflect. But I think it's more important to sort of understand that when this is happening to us all, which enables us to connect with more and more people, I would argue, but to sort of to find meaning in this and to say, okay, well, this is another test of life, and sort of what can I do to sort of get through this? Frankl talks a lot about how, some of the folks that didn't make it were the ones who just died of broken hearts. And by that, I mean, the ones who were kind of like, okay, well, maybe by, March or by the summer we'll be out, the war will be over. If you think about the pandemic, if we're constantly thinking about when the vaccine is going to be out, when are things going to get better, it's going to be a long wait, right? Like, I don't know. And so rather than sort of hinging sort of some of our happiness perhaps to that sort of goal, it's really to think about, okay, what can we do to sort of get by now? And hey, now is the best time and easiest time to sort of eat the best way that we should be eating, sleep as much sleep as we can get in, or doing as much exercise as we should be doing. Like, in fact, I miss the gym so much. I was doing it like 3-4 times a week. I was running over 5 kilometers every 2 days. I was in great shape, and then the world changed, and so we have to adapt. So what do I do? Well, I grow a beard. I'm just kidding. I did, but
the next logical step.
It makes the most sense.
But I guess learning to adapt, and sort of, I guess it's what we talked about last time too, is just this idea of being kind to yourself too.
Mm-hmm.
That helps,
yeah,
or makes sense.
And I think that's so relevant, like such a relevant and great perspective to have kind of on the current state of the world, because it's easy just to feel, as you said, like super bogged down when you just keep thinking like, okay, when is this going to be over? When is this going to be over? And I think that can even be applied really well into other like situations in lives, especially for students, like during our exam period. If all you're thinking about is like, when is this going to be over? When is this going to be over? Rather than like, okay, what can I make of this? Like, how can I like learn the most I can about calculus or whatever subject you're studying, rather than just thinking like, okay, I can't wait to be home for Christmas break, which is like a fair desire. Like, I've definitely
that's like, sure, absolutely.
But it's like a really, really applicable thing to think about, because it's kind of just like, what can you gain out of this without just only thinking about like, when is it going to end, which I think is such a great perspective. Our next question, if you want to touch on it, I think you spoke to it a lot, but if you have any more specific advice, is just specific to university students regarding like, a lot of us are dealing with questions such as like, what job do I want after graduation? What are my morals and values on the like with relation to the world? What are my plans after school? What do I want to do with my life? These are all things we're being asked on a day-to-day basis. So I was just going to say, like, what do you think it's important for students to keep in mind while they're trying to like identify their purpose in life and try to figure out what's fulfilling for them?
Right. Good questions. I guess I was thinking about this, of course, a lot beforehand too. And, it's important to know that, and here's a little secret, it gets better, but it doesn't necessarily get easier either, right? The decisions and the pressures only get harder and add up more. And the time that you have to yourself now, believe it or not, despite how much you think you're going to be studying and in these books and doing these exams, it becomes less and less, the older you get, especially as you progress through your career in whatever sort of way you end up developing. And so enjoy the time that you have now too, because it does get shorter and shorter. But back to, I guess, what I was saying earlier, with this idea of sort of, how can I learn to sort of, be myself, be authentic, and understand myself in a world that is always changing and dynamic, and, that I do have all these pressures, and how can I be me? Well, this idea of trusting your gut, that's important. And it's silly to say this, but it is important to sort of go out there, especially in university, party, have fun, but remember to reflect and remember to understand the next day when you're in pain. You're like, oh yeah, that happened. And I'm just really interested in why you did it. I'm not saying abstain from any of that, because I mean, you can if you really want to, and that's your jam, and that's important too. But if it's not, you do enjoy having fun, go have fun. And there's many types of having fun, of course. But, learn from these experiences. And especially, I think, in addition to sort of putting together some of the great sort of life skills that you'll pick up from, going to class, learning exams, working in groups and projects, really embrace the people that you meet, because some of these relationships, and connections will last a lifetime. The friends that I've made in university are way thicker and way stronger and deeper than any of the friendships that I had in previous school, right, in elementary and high school. That's also because I didn't sort of grow into my own shoes, figuratively speaking, until I was in university, which I would argue most people don't either. And that's okay. Darn, I was going to say something else. What was it? Yeah. So, I mean, I guess back to what I was saying regarding that parable or the story about my kids, is just pick yourself up again. Oh, and if you can, put together a relationship with your professor, because they're people too. And I have to say, when I was at school, especially when I was at the University of Guelph, I made an effort to really connect with my professors personally, because, I mean, one, they're fascinating people, because, you got to love what you're doing to be a professor, right? Especially if you're in the social sciences / humanities, because it's very encompassing, and man, everybody's got a story. And I guess the more stories they can learn about people, you can sort of take on and sort of learn from too.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great insight, especially, sorry, Alex, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I love that advice. It's such an actionable thing to take away from this. And yeah, you can learn so much just by chatting with your professors. And I feel like so many of them are way more open than we think that they are to just having conversations and that are like not just related to a very specific question for school. So I love that. That's all I want to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agree. And I think kind of tying back to what you were talking about earlier about getting bogged down by challenge, and especially obviously something that's really challenging for people and students specifically, given online school and everything going on with that, is the pandemic, of course. But I think it just brings up a great topic overall, which is failure and dealing with failure, because that is, again, something that a lot of students are trying to learn for the first time when they're going through university, and how to persevere and kind of thrive in those situations of failure. So how do you personally deal with failure in your career, and how have you learned to change experiences of failure into lessons?
Right. Well, I mean, being in sales for the last 15 or so years, I'm professionally being told no all the time, and so you really have to have thick skin, figuratively speaking, of course, to sort of, I guess, do this to do this type of job, because not everybody likes being told no, or that they don't want this, right? And it's easy to take things personally, because it is personal, right? And you could apply this idea of failure and sort of rejection to everything in our lives, especially, going from that transition from, say, high school, where you're a hot shot, to university, where all of a sudden you're a small fish in a big sea. Mm-hmm. And then the first time that paper comes back that you thought you nailed it, all of a sudden you see this, B-, or heaven forbid, a C, or even a D. Okay, let's go C, reasonably. It's shocking, but you can sort of take that and sort of say no. You could just refute and say it's on the professor or whomever. It's not me. Or you could really sort of think about the experience and understand, well, why did this happen? Could I have done something differently? Could I have sort of written sort of, or approached or tackled this problem another way? And apply that to my professional life, where, yeah, of course, I'm constantly being told by people that, okay, maybe we're saying no. Well, why? Is it your pricing? Is it the cost? Is it our technology? Is it me? Because at the end of the day, too, that's important, because sort of one of our biggest sort of competitive advantages outside of our tech and a service and our offering is that you get me. And I enjoy working with each and every one of my clients, great and small. And I've worked with startups who have created little 25-cent video games on the computer to the biggest of the big sort of out there services. And so it's been exciting to be a part of that. And, it's okay to sort of accept that rejection and sort of take it and sort of like brood for a day or two, but you really have to pick yourself up and sort of say, I got this, I'm going to learn from it, and you do it. And it's having that grit, having that sort of perseverance to get through school, get through that relationship, that breakup, or that social event that it was all fun and then something happened and the next 3 days are chaotic, because that happens to the best of us too. But get through it and sort of, you're going to change along the way, but as long as you're learning. Right?
Definitely. I think that's so applicable to students now, but of course, going forward, as you're speaking to in your career in sales, like it's just going to continue to be even more and more applicable as we continue through our professional journeys. And I especially love that little piece of advice you gave within there of like the importance of the feedback component of failure, not just, for example, with students, not just seeing a bad grade and that's that, but actually looking at the feedback you've received or seeking out further feedback, I think is something I'm guilty of not always doing. And I think it's an amazing piece of advice to have students like keep in mind when going through those experiences of failure.
Yeah, it's easy to sort of talk to people with regard to this feedback loop of, okay, well, what did I do right? It's harder, but more important, I would argue about, well, what is it that you don't like? What did I not do? Right? And so that's important too. So yeah, I agree.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's an awesome point. So I think just building off of the aspect of failure for university students a bit more generally, if you could give some advice to university students about managing or improving their mental health during this period. I think you've touched on this a lot, but if you just want to summarize everything into like a couple points of just what could you tell to maybe like your 20-year-old self or your kids when they're in university about what to do to manage their mental well-being?
I've said a bunch of things over and over. This idea of trusting your instinct, trusting your gut is very important. This idea of push yourself to sort of tackling something that is uncomfortable. Do that which sort of, go to that social event that you feel like, oh, I don't really want to do it, but I know that there are good things to do. So constantly push yourself to sort of do more and don't settle for good. Go for great all the time. But I would argue most importantly of all this, or right up there with trust yourself, is express yourself. And by that, I mean, talk to yourself, talk to your parents, talk to your friends, your siblings, your partners, talk about your feelings, right? Because in school, especially as you sort of progress, especially into the career world, this idea of feelings, you think it's not important, but it is. It's extremely important. And everybody's got it, especially in sales. Right, so the people that I'm dealing with, different parts of the company, from CXOs to engineering folks, and they've all got different sort of motives, but at the end of the day, we're all people, and sort of being able to connect, understand yourself is important. And you do that by just sort of living, talking, and also learning a lot, right? I like to read. It's very important because it helps give you the language to articulate what you're feeling, right? We all see movies and we can sort of talk about, oh, wow, this made me feel this way. But without those words, do you really feel these things? The answer is yes, but it helps having to sort of a way to sort of communicate them.
That's awesome. I think that actually ties perfectly into another question we were going to talk about, was about communicating with others. You spoke to just how important that is to be able to reach out to all those around you, because of course we all are people at the end of the day, but it can be challenging when you're still trying to approach those conversations, especially the ones where you're trying to be vulnerable and open up about those emotions and feelings that you're going through. So what advice would you have for someone that's trying to approach that type of conversation? And speaking to any personal experience you have, or just general advice about the best way to go about that and be successful in those conversations.
It's tricky and hard to get anybody to change. So don't make that really your end goal. But I would argue, be vulnerable first. And it's amazing how deeper and richer of a connection that you can make with somebody by sort of making that first step forward. So, when you're engaging with somebody for the first time or doing something that's, is expected of everybody, raise your hand first, get in there. It's okay to mess up and fail. I remember when I was in grade 8, for example, I don't know if you guys remember, but in elementary school, did you all have to remember we have to write a speech and then present in front of our class? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that was the scariest part of the year.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, it's frightening, truly. And so I'm a silly guy. And years ago, many years ago, of course, so think about how long, but I remember being in, say, middle school and seeing one of the older kids present their speech in front of the entire school. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids. And his speech was about ketchup. And I thought, I like this. So fast forward a couple of years, I'm now in grade 8. I wrote a speech about relish. And as it happened, I got to, everybody loved it in my class, and I was selected to read my speech in front of the whole school. And so I read my speech about relish in front of everybody. And I was also selected to go first. And I'm glad I was selected first because everybody else behind me, they were doing some really serious speeches. So I'm glad I got to do mine first. And so, I don't know, there's a lot less pressure sometimes, although it feels like there's more going first. When you go first, when you be vulnerable first, bring you back, it makes everybody else feel at ease too. And you feel good about sort of overcoming that sort of which, a second prior to that was challenging or that you were anxious or nervous about, right? The water, you don't know how cold it is unless you jump in. So just put your toe in, jump in.
Definitely. And you're speaking to as well, I like that point about you don't try to change people, because often that's not going to be successful and that's probably not going to get you to where you want to be going anyways. And I think that ties into the whole idea of how do you have empathy in those conversations when perhaps you don't get the answer you're looking for, you don't get the reaction you were hoping for when you do open up to somebody. So how would you say to best approach those conversations again where it doesn't go how you were hoping or you don't get the answer you were looking for?
Approach it delicately. It depends on this. It depends on the situation, of course. Nobody likes a sore loser, but when you're dealing with something personal, sort of very sort of connected one-to-one, be delicate, because not everybody is ready to sort of open up and to talk about themselves, even if you are right away. So just keeping that sort of line of communication open is key. And if anything, that's probably the best thing that you can do, especially if you're trying to work with somebody who is dealing with something very hard, as we all go through. But that doesn't belittle the fact that whatever anybody is going through isn't important to them. And sort of this idea of empathy allows you to sort of to see that and to sort of feel things from their perspective, and to know that that's okay too. And so, knowing that the best that I can do here is either, just letting you know that the communication is open. And so for me professionally, it's always learning, okay, well, why didn't this work out? I get that perhaps, there are different times that it happens, but, and sort of tackling it that way. And, I have a competitor, and, when I lose out to a competitor, it's mighty tricky. But understanding the process of why and improving upon that is very important. Otherwise, it'll keep happening over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that's great advice. Just again, like what you're saying in your career, but as well, like dealing with relationships and minding people's feelings, as well as like trying to have those important conversations and get what you need out of them. I think is such a difficult balance sometimes, but very important to keep in mind when we're going forward.
Yeah.
Alex, did you have anything else to add? That was the questions from me, but.
I was just going to say I loved that you talked about keeping the line of conversation open, because especially when you're dealing with or approaching someone, maybe if you're concerned about them or just to see how they're doing. And a lot of people sometimes when they're first approached may be like a little bit in shock or super nervous and not ready to talk about something yet. But I think that's a great point, because it's like at least they know that they have someone there for them. And as they maybe get a little bit more comfortable with their situation or how they're feeling, it's like knowing that, okay, at some point, like I feel like I have this person that I can go to speak with is such an important support system to have. So I think that that's a great point for people, even when they're just trying to help out a friend or a family member or something, just to keep in mind, because not everyone's ready to talk right away, but at least knowing that there's someone there is like a great thing to have. But yeah, that's all from me.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Awesome.
That sounds great.
Well, thank you so much again, Roy. This has been such a great conversation. I think we were able to touch on so much, whether it's like professional advice about personal well-being, and then also that piece about being there for those around you and how to open up to those around you, which I think all three of those elements are so applicable to what students are going through today, and I think are really going to resonate with our audience, which is very exciting. So again, thank you so much, and hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks for speaking with us.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And also, if anybody wanted to be in touch, or if they had any further questions, you can always reach me by email, Twitter, or even LinkedIn, for example.
Perfect.
Amazing.
We'll be sure to include that. Thank you
Wonderful.
so much, Roy. Have
Thank
a good
you.
one.
Cheers.